She insulted an ordinary customer only to discover he owned the place and was Keanu Reeves. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Coastal Grill, a cozy yet bustling restaurant in Monterey, California. It wasn't some high-end five-star establishment, but it had a certain charm, a mix of rustic warmth and modern appeal that made it a local favorite. The scent of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the sound of silverware clinking against plates and the constant murmur of conversation. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the place was packed. Every table was occupied, and the staff were practically sprinting from one end of the restaurant to the other, struggling to keep up with endless requests. The lunch rush had started hours ago, but instead of dying down, it seemed to be stretching into infinity. Orders were piling up, drinks needed refilling, and the kitchen was running at full steam. For Samantha, a 24-year-old waitress barely scraping by on minimum wage, terrible tips, and the weight of her student loans, this shift felt like an endless battle against exhaustion and frustration. She had been on her feet for hours, dodging impatient customers, apologizing for wrong orders that weren't even her fault, and trying to stretch a forced smile across her face when all she wanted to do was scream. Her feet ached, her ponytail was falling loose, and the heat from the kitchen felt suffocating. But what pushed her over the edge wasn't just the long shift or the entitled customers. It was the fact that, despite all the effort, she barely made enough in tips to justify dealing with it all. Just as she thought she might finally get a second to breathe, the front door swung open, and in walked a man in his late 50s. He didn't make a scene, didn't call attention to himself, just strolled in quietly and took a seat at one of the corner tables. Samantha gave him a quick, dismissive glance. Old flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a beat-up baseball cap. He looked like one of those guys who orders a single coffee, sits there forever, and leaves a $1 tip, if that. She sighed, grabbing her notepad. Great. Just what I needed. The man didn't stand out much at first glance. He wasn't dressed in designer clothes, didn't have an air of importance, and certainly didn't carry himself like someone expecting special treatment. He wore a slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, and a faded baseball cap, the kind of outfit that suggested practicality over fashion. His boots looked like they had seen their fair share of miles, the leather scuffed, the soles worn down just enough to show they had walked through more than just city streets. Samantha barely acknowledged him at first, too caught up in the chaos of her shift. She had spent the last few hours dodging impatient customers, handling complaints about undercooked steaks, and forcing smiles at people who barely noticed her existence. So, when she finally turned her attention to the new customer sitting alone at table 14, her first thought wasn't particularly kind. She let out a quiet sigh, just loud enough for herself to hear. Great, she muttered under her breath. Another one who's going to order a coffee, sit here forever, and leave me $1. She didn't have the patience for another low-maintenance, low-tipping customer. Not today. Before she could decide whether to approach him right away or put it off for another minute, Lisa, her coworker, nudged her in the side. That's yours, Lisa said with a tilt of her head toward the man. Table 14. Samantha sighed again, grabbing her notepad off the counter with the same enthusiasm as someone heading into a Monday morning meeting after a sleepless night. She plastered on a half-hearted, forced smile, the kind that barely reached her eyes, and made her way over. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight edge of impatience despite her best attempt to sound pleasant. The man looked up at her, meeting her gaze with calm, piercing eyes. There was something about him, something familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention without trying, not in an arrogant way, but in a way that made her feel like he was quietly observing more than just the menu. "Just a burger," he said, his deep voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that caught her off guard. Samantha tapped her pen against her notepad, nodding. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" The man shook his head slightly before replying. "No, ma'am." Then, almost as an afterthought, he tipped his cap, a small, polite gesture. That was the moment Samantha officially lost what little patience she had left. She rolled her eyes as she turned away, muttering under her breath, "Ma'am? Seriously?" She was 24, not 60. The last thing she needed today was to be reminded of how exhausted she felt. Without waiting for a response, she hurried back to the kitchen, shaking her head as she went. A few minutes later, Samantha emerged from the kitchen with the man's order, balancing the plate in one hand as she weaved between occupied tables. The restaurant was still buzzing with activity, servers rushing past her, customers chatting over their meals, and the faint clatter of silverware against plates filling the air. When she reached table 14, she set the plate down with a little less care than she normally would, the ceramic making a slight clunk as it met the wooden surface. She wasn't rude exactly, but she wasn't going out of her way to be overly polite either. "Here you go," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, already shifting her weight as if she were ready to move on. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger for a moment, then looked back up at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His voice was calm, polite, but there was something about it, firm yet kind, steady yet authoritative, that made Samantha feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a second, though she wasn't sure why. Normally, she would have been halfway across the restaurant by now. But there was something about this guy. He wasn't flustered, wasn't impatient, wasn't demanding anything. In a place filled with noise and hurried movement, he was just sitting there, completely at ease, as if he had all the time in the world. That somehow unnerved her. Without really thinking, she blurted out, "You're not from around here, are you?" The man paused, then picked up his knife and cut the burger cleanly in half with precise, measured movements. "No, I'm not," he finally replied, lifting his gaze back to hers. Samantha smirked, crossing her arms. "Thought so. The hat gave it away. You look like you just stepped out of an old movie." For the first time, the man cracked a faint smile, just a small upward curve at the corners of his mouth. "Something like that," he said. Most people would have laughed, gotten defensive, or at least reacted in some noticeable way. But not him. He just sat there, completely unfazed, as if he had heard it all before. And that somehow made it worse. Samantha shifted slightly, feeling an unfamiliar sense of frustration creeping up. She didn't know why, but something about his unshakable demeanor annoyed her. "You know," she said, lowering her voice slightly as if sharing a secret, "most people around here don't dress like that." The man took his time, lifting half of the burger and taking a slow, deliberate bite before answering. "I guess I'm not most people." The words were simple, but there was something about the way he said them that made Samantha feel like she'd just walked into a conversation she didn't fully understand. For a moment, she felt oddly self-aware, like she had been the one on display this whole time, not him. A strange feeling settled in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Shaking her head slightly, she turned and walked away. Though for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction had been anything but ordinary. As the lunch rush finally started to slow, Samantha leaned against the counter, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time all shift, she had a second to relax, at least as much as one could in a restaurant where the chaos never truly stopped. She pulled out her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly, but her attention kept drifting back to table 14. The man was still there, finishing his meal in no apparent hurry, sipping his water while quietly observing the restaurant. Unlike most customers, who either buried their faces in their phones or waved impatiently for the check. He just sat there, calm and composed, like he was taking everything in. It was almost like he was studying the place, though Samantha couldn't imagine why. Lisa passed by, balancing a tray of dirty dishes, and leaned in close. "Doesn't he look kind of familiar?" she whispered. Samantha rolled her eyes, shoving her phone back into her apron pocket. "Yeah, sure. And if he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Lisa smirked but didn't press the issue, heading back toward the kitchen. A few moments later, Samantha grabbed the check and made her way over to table 14. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint, mechanical smile. "Whenever you're ready." Instead of reaching for it right away, the man looked up at her, locking eyes with a gaze that felt more intentional than before. "Do you enjoy your job?" The question caught her completely off guard. People asked for extra napkins, drink refills, and condiments, but no one ever asked that. Samantha blinked, then shrugged. "It's fine. A job's a job, you know." He nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. "A job is what you make of it," he said. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Samantha felt her face flush. She didn't like the way he said it. Not in a rude way, but in a way that made her feel exposed, like he had seen right through her forced politeness. She crossed her arms. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. He just leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes, how you treat people in tough moments says more about you than you think." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he reached into his pocket, pulled out some cash, and placed it on the table. "I'll leave you with that thought." He pushed his chair back and stood up, adjusting his cap before heading toward the door. Samantha shook her head, muttering under her breath. "Yeah, whatever." And then, everything changed. Her manager, Caroline, suddenly burst out from the office, moving with a sense of urgency she never showed for anyone. "Mr. Reeves," she exclaimed, her voice full of genuine admiration. "I wasn't expecting you today." Samantha froze mid-step. "Reeves?" Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned toward the exit, her stomach twisting into a knot. The man, the quiet, unassuming guy she had just dismissed without a second thought, turned back slightly, flashing a small, knowing smile as he shook Caroline's hand. And then, just like that, he walked out the door. Samantha felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. Her legs felt weak as realization sank in. She had just spent the last 20 minutes being completely dismissive, borderline rude, to one of the most famous, beloved actors in the world. Worse than that, he wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the restaurant she worked at. Samantha barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene played over in her head. The way she had rolled her eyes, the impatience in her voice, the moment she had muttered under her breath, completely unaware that she was speaking to Keanu Reeves. Would he tell Caroline? Would she walk into work and find herself handed a final paycheck and a goodbye? Would she become a cautionary tale among her co-workers? The girl who managed to insult the owner of the restaurant without even realizing it? By the time her alarm rang the next morning, her stomach was twisted in knots. She had never dreaded a shift more. When she arrived at Coastal Grill, the restaurant felt different. Or maybe it was just her. Every little interaction felt magnified. She caught herself overthinking the way she greeted customers, the way she smiled, the way she handled orders. She refilled drinks before anyone had to ask. She forced herself to be extra patient, and she put in more effort than she had in months. For the first few hours, everything was business as usual, until just before lunch, she heard a voice that made her heart stop mid-beat. "Well, looks like you're busy today." Samantha whipped around so fast she nearly knocked over a tray of silverware. There he was, Keanu Reeves, standing near the counter, hands casually in his pockets, looking at her with that same calm, unreadable expression. Her throat went dry. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his mouth curving into the faintest smile. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." She swallowed hard. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." He nodded, glancing around as if he were taking in the energy of the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little tense." She hesitated. Of course, he noticed. He probably noticed everything. About yesterday," she began, bracing herself for whatever came next. But before she could finish, he raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said easily. "I'm not here to make your life harder." Samantha blinked, caught completely off guard. "You're not?" "No." He shook his head. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to, or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." There was no judgment in his voice, no condescension, just genuine wisdom, spoken with the kind of calm authority that made her stomach twist for an entirely different reason. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Not out of fear, but something else. Regret. Because she knew he was right. How many times had she snapped at customers because she assumed they wouldn't tip? How often had she let a bad mood dictate the way she treated people? How many moments had she wasted thinking this job was just a job, when in reality, it was an opportunity to be better? She exhaled slowly, nodding. "I understand." For the first time in a long time, she actually meant it. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. "Good." Then, with the same effortless ease he always carried, he tipped his cap slightly. "Take care, Samantha." And just like that, he turned and walked out the door. Samantha stood there for a moment, frozen in place, her heart pounding. She had spent so much time waiting for a wake-up call. And somehow, it had come in the form of a burger, an old hat, and one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But it wasn't his fame that changed her. It was the lesson. Because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to be better. And now, she finally knew how to start.